All right. Well, did you bring your seatbelts with you? You're going to want to put them on. So if you do have questions, remember, this is not just a monologue. You are welcome. You have the prerogative, if you feel like it, to at any time throw up your hand and say, wait, that didn't make sense, or what was this again? I'm not sure I understand that. And if you're brave enough, you're welcome to do that. So, all right, a couple of key reminders. Daniel 10 through 12 are one single unit. Did you know that the divisions in the Bible into chapters was actually done around the year 1205 AD? Which, of course, is over 1,000 years after the time that Jesus himself was living on the earth and the time of the apostles. So it was many, many years later, because initially all the information just ran together. But it became necessary to find certain passages or places. How do you find it without wading through all of the material? Someone saw the insight, the wisdom. It was actually Stephen Langton. He was an Archbishop of Canterbury in England. And he went through and kind of made these divisions, kind of where it looked like would be a good break to have a chapter, and that kind of became the accepted way of dividing things into chapters ever since that time, 800 years ago, but over 1,000 years after the time of the Bible and when it was compiled together in the first century. So anyway, so the point is, Daniel 10 and 12 are really all together, but we're studying them as different chapters as if it's a separate piece. But Daniel 11 is really connected to 10, and it's also connected to 12. It's really one continuous event or sequence. Does that make sense? All right. Now, another point I want to just mention here, the symbols in Daniel 11 apply to literal Israel, that's the literal Israelites, in reference to events that take place before the cross. The focus of when it mentions Israel and Jerusalem, it's referring to the literal, the nation or the Jewish nation, the state of Israel. But after the time of the cross, it is spiritual Israel that is the reference to when you see the terminology for Jerusalem and Israel and the glorious Holy Land and the glorious Holy Mountain, things which have a literal meaning in a sense before the cross, representing literal Israel, but after the cross and the establishment of the Christian church. And I have a couple of references up here if you'd like to look at these. Paul says in Romans 2, he is not a Jew that is one outwardly, but he that is a Jew is one that is one inwardly. And he's talking about the faith and quality of the character of the person that really determines if they're an Israelite. And I quoted these before as well. Galatians 3, Paul also says to the Galatians, that know ye therefore that they which are of faith, the same are the children of Abraham. And he says that if you are Christ, in Galatians 3:29, if you belong to Christ, then are you really Abraham's seed or Abraham's children and heirs according to the promise. So Abraham's true children, spiritual Israel, is the focus in the New Testament after the cross. So anyway, I don't know if that will make some sense or not. And this is just a map to show, to remind me to say that Daniel 11, just like the previous visions that we've seen in, by the way, if you want a copy of my notes, I'll give that to you for free. I mean, afterwards, I can email it to you so you don't have to sweat too much through the pictures or writing things down and get carpal tunnel. But Daniel 11 is going to parallel the same as Daniel 2, the same as Daniel 7, and the same as Daniel 8 and 9, where we had the sequence of the kingdom of Babylon, the kingdom over here is the interpretation, Babylon and Medo-Persia, Greece, then the divisions of Greece, Alexander's empire with the four generals, then Rome, pagan Rome, then the division of Rome at the fall of the Roman Empire with the 10 horns and the 10 toes, 476, then the rise of papal Rome from 538 to 1798, and then we'll get down to this cleansing of the sanctuary, and then Daniel 7 talked about the announcement of the judgment. Those events are the same thing, referred to in different terms, but the judgment in Daniel 7 verses 9 and 10 is the same as the cleansing of the sanctuary in Daniel 8:14. And that represents what time period we're living in now, the hour of God's judgment. And I handed out a paper that kind of explained some of that last time about what is the cleansing of the sanctuary. Judgment begins with the house of God, not with the wicked. And we can study the judgment of the wicked in Revelation. And then all the way down to some of the events here, like with Daniel 2, the stone that was cut out pictures the second coming of Jesus, because the judgment will be complete when Jesus comes, because in Revelation 22, verses 11 and 12, he says, my reward is with me to give every man and every woman according as their work shall be. So, and then finally, we have a picture of the kingdom that the righteous or the saints will inherit, which is the new earth. So anyway, that Daniel 11 is going to follow this same outline and expand on some of the details. So these are, and why are all these kingdoms and powers mentioned? Remember, I think I said to you before, these are mentioned because they all had a direct impact on God's people. Whether it's literal Israel before the cross or spiritual Israel after the time of the cross. They all had some hand in affecting and impacting them, oftentimes in persecution. So that's why they're mentioned, because God is letting people know, I see what's happening to my people, I'm aware of it, and those that oppress my people, they will be held accountable for that. There's a time coming when there will be a judgment, and they'll be held accountable. So, let's see here. I didn't mean to put it all that. All right. I've got too much here preliminary before we get started. We're going to see that there are some significant transition points in Daniel 11, just as we were seeing before with those empires. The first two verses, second, third, and fourth verse will be referring to Persia and Greece. Just 3 verses are going to cover all those 2 empires. Then we're going to see a division in verses 5 through 15 of the 4 Greek empires. 16 through 22 will be showing and talking about the Roman Empire, imperial Rome, that is papal Rome. And then 30 through 37 will be talking about the Dark Ages and this 1260 years of persecution that was during the time of papal supremacy. Daniel 11 verse 40 is giving us, it's a clear marker for the time of the end. And we know that the angel said at the end of the time of this persecution in 1798, that would mark the beginning, biblically, prophetically speaking, of the time of the end. So from 1798 until the coming of Jesus, the time we're living in now, is prophetically speaking the time of the end, according to the definition of the Bible, without question. And then we need the first 2 verses of Daniel 12 to show us what's going to happen just before Jesus comes. There will be a close of human probation, and it describes a time of trouble such as never was, and we'll get to those things later on. But these things take place just before the coming of Jesus, according to Daniel chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. But remember, it's all one piece. 10, 11, and 12 are one piece that go together. So here we go. Let's get started with Daniel 11 and verse 1. I'm in 1 Thessalonians. I'm in the right book. Here we go. Daniel 11, verse 1. Let's read it and see what we can discover. Now remember, let me mention this. Every single verse we're going to read, all 45 verses, are a statement and an exposition by the angel Gabriel. All of chapter 11. So keep that in mind. Daniel is listening to Gabriel explain to him the vision that Daniel saw in chapter 10 when he was there on the banks of the Hiddekel River. So Daniel 11 verse 1, it says, Also I, in the first year of Darius the Mede, he was the first king of Babylon after the Medes and Persians overthrew Babylon. Even I stood to confirm and to strengthen him. So Gabriel is saying that after Babylon fell to the Medes and Persians, we saw in Daniel 10, there was this spiritual warfare to influence Cyrus the king, that he took his position to try to help encourage and influence Darius to do what God's will was, to stand, to strengthen, and to confirm him. Now, let's go to Daniel 11, verse 2, because it says, And now will I show thee the truth. Behold, there shall stand up yet what? 3 kings in Persia, and the 4th shall be far richer than they all, and by his strength, through his riches, he shall stir up all against the realm of, what does it say? Against the realm of Grecia. So, what do we see? There would stand up 3 kings in Persia after Cyrus, who was then ruling. And so the Bible doesn't tell us this, but from our now remember, when Daniel is told this information, from verse 1 all the way to 45, it's all in the future. We have the privilege of looking back and seeing how all this has actually been fulfilled. But these are all in the future for Daniel. Some of these things like, oh, okay, that's not that big of a deal, but it was all predicted in the future. So 4 kings coming down from Cyrus, Cambyses, Bardia, Darius the First. We come to this 4th king here, Xerxes, who is called in the Bible Ahasuerus. He was the husband, if you read the book of Esther, which is in the Bible, he's called Ahasuerus. That is his Hebrew name. But Xerxes is the Greek name that he went by. And it says that a 4th king would come up, and he would be far richer than they all, and his strength through his riches he shall stir up all against the realm of Grecia. Here is Xerxes sitting on his throne as he has been carried all the way from Persia, hundreds and hundreds, even 1,000 miles, across all the way to Greece itself, trying to attack Greece and invade Greece. And this is an artist's depiction of the Battle of Salamis in 470 Oh dear, what year is it? 478, 479, 480? I think I have it on the next slide. 480, there it is. Here's just a picture here, and this isn't history class, but I'll just tell you, Xerxes had he had a massive number of ships. He vastly outnumbered the Greeks who were hiding out here around this corner, and the Greeks sent someone over here to tell Xerxes that they were retreating and they were in disarray. A fake traitor. And so when they told Xerxes this, he got all of his fleet together and started coming into this narrow water channel here, this narrow water passage, and it was actually an ambush, a setup. And so all of the Greek ships that were small ultimately and had to return back to his home. So let's go to Daniel 11, verse 3. Lots of history in this, so much history. It says in verse 3, "And a mighty king shall stand up that shall rule with great dominion and do according to his will." A mighty king that shall stand up that came and wanted to attack the Persians, turning around, is actually going to be none other than Alexander the Great. We saw him in Daniel chapter 8 with the notable horn on the he-goat that attacked the ram with 2 horns that was Medo-Persia. The ram was Medo-Persia and the he-goat was Greece. And it said the notable horn was the first king, Alexander the Great. And here's just a map showing his conquest. Over the course of about 10 years, he left over here. This was the capital of the Macedonians in Pella. Macedonia is the northern part of Greece. Crosses over, this is the crossing point into Asia. And then went all the way down, went into Egypt, came back. But notice here, right here, the impact we're going to see as we start talking about the kings of the north and the kings of the south. Jerusalem and God's people, literal Israel, are going to be in the middle of a conquest or battles between the kings of the north, which are going to be up here, and the kings of the south, which are going to be down here, which makes, geographically, that just makes sense. Because of the location, as these two are fighting against each other, well, who's in the middle? Who's going to get caught in the crossfire? It's God's people that are there in Jerusalem. So, at any rate, and he goes all the way over, and even goes as far as India, before his soldiers said, we don't want to go any farther, we're going to turn around and head back. And as Alexander heads back, he begins to set up his government. Where is it? There it is. He actually dies in Babylon at the age of 33. As just a young person. And from that point, well, we'll see what happens in verse 4, because you guys know what's going to happen because we've read this in other chapters, but it's just spelled out in a little more specific language in Daniel 11, verse 4. "And when he shall stand up, his kingdom shall be broken," this is Alexander, "and shall be divided toward the 4 winds of heaven." And it says, "and not to his posterity." So what would his posterity be? His children. And we know, here's a map showing the division of what was once all Alexander's empire himself. As soon as he had conquered it all and died, it was divided up amongst his 4 leading generals. And they were not his children. Yes, Kim?
The Ptolemies there prior to?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. Very good question. And they're going to be a big focus of a big part of this chapter. But Ptolemy was one of the generals of Alexander, and he comes down after Alexander dies and gains control of this area. And some of these other generals control these other areas, but it's not until after the death of Alexander, which is in 323 BC. This whole chapter we're going to be marching down towards the time we're living in today. We're actually going to get to today, if I don't talk too much. So, good question. We read the rest of the verse. "And not to his posterity, nor according to his dominion which he ruled, for his kingdom shall be plucked up even for others beside those." So, divided amongst his generals and not to his children. And here's where we have Daniel 11, verse 5. "And the king of the south shall be strong, and one of his princes, and he shall be strong above him, and have dominion. His dominion shall be a great dominion." So we have the introduction of a term here called the king of the south. And the king of the south is going to be a reference to the ruler of Egypt for the first part of Daniel 11, but it's going to shift. And you might think, well, how is that possible? It's because after the cross, we're not talking about specific literal geographic terms. We're talking in spiritual terms. It's somewhat different. And the king of the north is going to be the Seleucids, which is the modern day area of Syria. And here's Jerusalem, and back and forth. We're going to see for about the next 10 verses, there's going to be fighting between these two, and their descendants fighting each other, and Jerusalem and God's people are going to be caught up in the middle of it. So sometimes they're under the control of the Ptolemies, sometimes they're under the control of the Seleucids and the kingdom of the north. So back and forth it goes. So let's go to Daniel 11, verse 6. And in the end of years, they shall join themselves together, for the king's daughter of the south, that's Egypt, or the Ptolemies, shall come to the king of the north, that's Syria and the Seleucids, to make an agreement. But she shall not retain the power of the arm, neither shall he stand, nor his arm. But she shall be given up, and they that brought her, and he that begat her, and he that strengthened her in these times. Now, does that sound confusing or what? That sounds like a lot of confusion. Let me try to explain some of the details here. As these generals, they were not strong enough to defeat each other, even though they wanted to defeat each other and to take the territory from each other. In verse 6, there is this description of they shall join themselves together, for the king's daughter of the south shall come to the king of the north. And so actually in history, there's this arrangement where one of the daughter of the king of the south was sent to the king of the north, but once they got married, the king of the north was already married, and his name was Antiochus, and once he got married to the daughter of the king of the south, he didn't like her as much as his former wife, and so he divorced her and remarried his first wife, whose name was Laodice. Well, when Laodice came back into power, she's like, what is he going to do next? I don't know. So she decides to poison her husband, the king of the north, and his ex-wife, and his ex-wife's son that he had with her husband. And so anyway, then her son is made king, the next one in the line, Seleucus II. So you can imagine how that's going to anger the king of the south because of this arrangement in Daniel 11, verse 6. So here's a list now of some of the kings that ruled. This is starting from the death of Alexander Ptolemy Soter the first and Seleucus Nicator the first here, and the descendants that come after them. And these next few verses are really just going to be showing fighting back and forth. And let me just say this. I mean, it might sound almost obscure, but what is interesting is this is the time period between the Old and the New Testaments. In the Bible, we don't really, I mean, Malachi, the last book of the Old Testament, was written, circa 400 BC. And then there's just a prophetic silence until Jesus is born. And you've got the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But there's about 400 years, it's called the intertestamental period, in which there's no Bible record. But Daniel 11, some of these verses cover in a prophecy what would happen during that time. This time between the Old and the New Testaments. Because there were things happening, certainly, but God had not seen fit to send a prophet. He actually waited and sent his son. It says in Hebrews chapter 1, verse 1, that God, who at sundry times and in divers manners spake in time past unto the prophets, spoke unto the fathers by the prophets, hath in these last days spoken unto us by his Son. He has spoken to us directly by his Son himself. And so Jesus was the one that came and spoke for God. But let's look at these verses in 7 through 9, which is going to be fighting back and forth between these two groups. It says, but one of a branch of her roots shall one stand up in his estate, which shall come with an army, and shall enter into the fortress of the king of the north, and shall deal against them, and shall prevail. Verse 8, and shall also carry captives into Egypt, their gods, with their princes, and with their precious vessels of silver and of gold, and he shall continue more years than the king of the north. So the king of the south shall come into his kingdom, and shall return into his own land. And so all of these things are leading up to a pretty significant battle here in 217 BC called the Battle of Raphia. The Battle of Raphia, which is what we're going to read about here in these next verses between these two kingdoms, the king of the north and the king of the south. It says in verse 10, but his sons shall be stirred up, and shall assemble a multitude of great forces, and one shall certainly come, and overflow, and pass through. Then shall he return, and be stirred up, even to his fortress. And the king of the south shall be moved with choler, that's King James language for anger, and shall come forth and fight with him, even with the king of the north. And he shall set forth a great multitude, but the multitude shall be given into his hand. And when he hath taken away the multitude, his heart shall be lifted up, and he shall cast down many 10,000s, but he shall not be strengthened by it. And that is a lot of details here. In this battle, you can see this artist's depiction. Both sides used war elephants. And they had to go as far away as India to try to get elephants, which is a long ways away. And they used them as like mobile fortresses. You see how they have them set up here where the soldiers can have like a little perch there where they can, mount attacks and so on. And elephants, I'll just tell you this, one of the ways they would get elephants are not, they're kind of cantankerous animals. One of the ways they would get them to cooperate somewhat was to ply them with alcohol, like get an elephant drunk. And the problem with that is that a drunk elephant, it doesn't really know where to go. You just hope that you point it in the right direction and prod it with a spear and just have it start running and charging, because it's going to break up the infantry lines and it's going to break up the cavalry, the mounted soldiers on horseback, which are always key in battles in historical times. The cavalry were always a key role. Alexander the Great was a master at using the cavalry to send it in at a moment in the battle and cause the enemy to be thrown into disarray and start retreating. But at any rate, the king of the north won this battle and defeated the Ptolemies. And even though they both had war elephants, and elephants they're very temperamental animals, and they were frightening to people in battle. I can imagine if you're in battle and you're there and you have an elephant coming after you, I'd run away too. I don't know if there's any shame in it. I ran from an elephant, a literal elephant. Is there any shame in that? Okay, now verse 13, and now it says, "For the king of the north shall return, and shall set forth a multitude greater than the former, and shall certainly come after certain years with a great army and with much riches." And this is talking about this king of the north here, whose name is Antiochus III. And it's interesting, I have a really sketchy picture. That's actually me. And I don't know if any of you know what this is. You'll get extra credit in history class if you know what this is. Yes, good. Okay, she knew what the Rosetta Stone is correct. This is in the British Museum in London. And in 2005, I took a group of students over to London, Paris, and Rome. I have another picture of something else we're going to see later on. But this was one of the most exciting things that I got to see. This is actually written in 3 languages. It's written in a script called Demotic. It's written in Aramaic, and it's written in hieroglyphics. And until this was discovered in the 1790s by some of Napoleon's soldiers in Egypt, they dug this up, hieroglyphics had been forgotten and was no longer understood anymore. But because this is written in 3 languages, and 2 of the languages we understood, and they could figure out that it's saying the same thing in both those languages, they could use that as a key to decipher hieroglyphics. And so it's a huge, historically. So now we can read hieroglyphics because of this stone right here. And at any rate, the information on here is about what we're reading about in Antiochus III and his invasion and attacks against the king of the south, the Ptolemies. And so, just as an interesting side note, even though it has significance for other reasons, the actual documentation and information is about these events. So, let's move on to verse 14, and we're going to begin to see a transition from one kingdom to another. It says, "And in those times there shall many stand up against the king of the south. Also the robbers of thy people shall exalt themselves to establish the vision, but they shall fall." In verse 14 we have the introduction. In literal Hebrew, let me go back. In literal Hebrew, the term for robbers of thy people literally means the breakers of thy people. And the breakers of thy people is none other than a reference to Rome. And we're going to now begin to see imperial Rome. In fact, let me pause. Not imperial Rome. Many of you might know that before Rome became an empire, it actually for many hundreds of years was called the Roman Republic. For a long time, the Roman Republic. Before, and we're going to get to the event that is the hinge between the Republic and the Empire is actually going to be Julius Caesar. And that's coming up in just a few verses. But during this time, Rome comes onto the scene and begins to get involved in the area of the king of the north and begins to try and control and make treaties with the Seleucids and even try to fight against them. But Rome is still small at this time in its power, but it's growing and expanding tremendously. But we see this reference, the breakers of thy people, is none other than the Roman people that are going to be on the scene more and more as we continue on. Daniel 11 verse 15, it says, "So the king of the north shall come and cast up a mount and take the most fenced cities, and the arms of the south shall not withstand, neither his chosen people, neither shall there be any strength to withstand." All right. So during this time, this battle that took place during this verse here, the Battle of Panium, in 200 BC, it marks the end of Ptolemaic rule in Judea forever. So the king of the south is now going to fade off the scenes, and it will not come back again until we get to verse 40 or 41, I believe. So the king of the south is no longer going to be mentioned. But the king of the north, now Antiochus the Great, has now secured the control of the area where God's people are, right here in Judea. And, of course, part of the reason is because he's fighting against a guy whose name was Ptolemy V. He was just a child, I believe he was at the time, of about 5 or 6 years old. He had regents that were overseeing the throne for him, but he himself was just a kid. And so he wasn't really making decisions at 5 or 6 years of age. But nonetheless, he was in waiting to grow up to be the one that would be in charge. And so at a young age, then Antiochus came and took advantage of him at that time. So now in Daniel 11, verse 16, it says, "But he that cometh against him shall do according to" what? His own will, and none shall stand before him, and he shall stand where? What is the glorious land? In the glorious land, that's a description to Palestine, Judea. The glorious land represents that area where God's people were, the glorious land. And this is the Roman invasion in verse 16, and this is actually an artist's drawing picture of the general, and maybe I should ask if anybody knows their Roman history very well. Who was it that came and conquered? And at first they had made a treaty that they were going to be friends with the Syrians and with the Jews, but as they grew into strength, they didn't want to be friends, they wanted to have power and control them. This is the Roman general Pompey the Great, Pompey, and in 63 BC he came in, laid siege, and brought Jerusalem and Judea under the control of the Romans. And so I'm going to suggest an idea here, is that although Rome, if you're looking at a map geographically, Rome is actually over here, and this is Jerusalem. Rome, because it gains the territory that once was the king of the north, comes down and even gains control of the area where God's people are, it is replacing the Seleucids as the king of the north, and so it's a replacement principle. Rome now becomes the king of the north, because it replaces and conquers and controls the same area and the same territory that was once under the control of the Seleucids. And so now, the transition, when you see the king of the north, it is in reference to, at first, imperial Rome, but it's going to shift again to another phase of Rome, just as we saw in the other chapters, that Rome had two phases, a pagan phase, and then, of course, when it shifts into the papal Roman phase later on. And that will come up as well. So here it is. Roman general Pompey conquered Syria in 65 BC, and Rome began to, here's of course the city and capital of Rome, but it began to expand across the Mediterranean. And in fact, at the height of the Roman Empire, the Romans called the whole Mediterranean area our sea. In fact, they had a Latin term for that. I think it was Mare Nostrum. Our sea, as if we own everything and control everything around it, and that's pretty much true when they rose to power. So it replaces over here in Syria, this area above Jerusalem, in terms of being in control of it. So Rome becomes the king of the north at the conquest of Pompey. Well, let's look at Daniel 11 and verse 17. It says, he shall also set his face to enter with the strength of his whole kingdom, and upright ones with him. Thus shall he do. And he shall give him the daughter of women, corrupting her, but she shall not stand on his side, neither be for him. And the description here in this verse is a very, I think, fitting description of Julius Caesar and his romantic involvement with Cleopatra, who was the queen of Egypt, which of course was the old king of the south, but Egypt had somewhat lost its dominion as Rome rose to power, but they still were a force to be reckoned with. And Julius Caesar, probably because of the historians debate, because of his feelings for her or whatever, went down to Egypt and wanted to spend time there. He actually fathered a child with Cleopatra, and anyway, but ultimately Cleopatra turned away from him and went for Mark Antony, someone else in history that was after Julius Caesar was killed. So she did not stay with him, but certainly I think he corrupted her, as it describes here in this verse. So Julius Caesar's conquest of of Egypt. But notice here in verses 18 and 19, it says, after this, this is the king of the north, representing Julius Caesar at his heyday. Julius Caesar had himself declared dictator for life. He is the last of the Roman Republic, and from after his death onward, it marks the beginning of the Roman Empire. All of his successors took the title Caesar, even though they weren't related to him as Caesar, but they took his name because they admired his position as what he was. See, it's interesting, ancient Rome, going all the way back to their legendary founding in 753 BC, with this fictional story of you probably heard the story of Romulus and Remus, the two twins that were abandoned and grew up there and were supposedly nursed by a she-wolf and grew up together. And eventually Romulus and Remus founded cities, and the city that Romulus founded, Rom sounds like Rome. He founded Rome, and Remus founded another city. And Romulus, as they grew older, went and defeated his brother, fought against his brother, and killed him. So Rome in its origins actually has fratricide, or killing of your own family as you come and rise to power. But the Romans and Romulus, they hated the idea of a king. And so calling yourself a king was like a political death sentence, a no-no in ancient Rome. And so Julius Caesar said, I'm not king, but Caesar. And all of his successors that came for years after that took that same title, even though they acted like a king, but they called themselves something different. They're not calling themselves a king, if that makes sense. Well, let's look here. These verses are going to describe the death of Julius Caesar. Yes, Gloria.
What does Caesar actually mean, or is it just
It was actually a family name.
Oh, okay.
It was actually his, yes.
Okay.
That's a good question, because when you study like Russian history, for example, in the 15, 17, 1600s, you have like the czars, all the way up. Tsar is actually a Russian form of the word Caesar.
Yeah.
And so the Russians actually, if you know history, they claim to be a third Rome. The second Rome is Constantinople, which we'll see in a second. But they claim to be following back on that ancient history of Rome and how glorious Rome was, and we're going to feed off of that and set ourselves up in a similar way. And so Tsar, in fact, even in World War I, Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany, Kaiser is also a form of the word Caesar in German. Tsar in Russian, Caesar. They all wanted to be like this guy, but here's Julius Caesar, and he's about to get stabbed 23 times.
He had a daughter. He didn't have any sons, right?
Was that Julius Caesar?
Yes.
Yes. And anyway, let me read the verses, and then I'll try to explain a little bit of details. It says, after this, shall he turn his face unto the isles, and shall take many, but a prince for his own behalf shall cause the reproach offered by him to cease. Without his own reproach he shall cause it to turn upon him. Then he shall turn his face toward the fort of his own land, but he shall stumble and fall and not be found. And especially verse 19, he shall stumble and fall and not be found. Julius Caesar had just at this time, many of you know that Julius Caesar, they talk about beware the Ides of March. The Ides, the middle of March, because that's the day that Julius Caesar died on, March 15, 44 BC. And he had set himself up to be dictator for life, and he had actually, in the Roman Senate, which was the highest body of their government, he had set up himself on a golden throne, and they were, he actually also had a toga made for him that was entirely made out of purple. You guys know why purple is associated with royalty. Is because back in ancient times it was such a rare color to make, because the way you would make purple is typically, it was by initially, of course we can make it synthetically now, by these crushed seashells that the Phoenicians, an earlier civilization, the Phoenicians were actually in what is today Lebanon, the area of Tyre and Sidon, the Phoenician people, but they would collect all these little crushed seashells or snails that are found in the water, and it would take thousands of them to make like an ounce of purple. And so just thousands of shells just to have this color. And so if you could afford purple, then you must be wealthy, and it's a status symbol. Purely a status symbol. And so that's how purple came to be associated with royalty, because of the color. And so when Julius Caesar had a toga, not that had a purple sash, but it was made entirely of purple, people were like, this guy's gone too far. We can't have this. And so some of his own associates conspired together to assassinate and stab him to death while he was there in the Senate. So he was stabbed to death, and in fact, they talk about how he pulled his toga over his head because they believed that nobody wanted to see, he didn't want anybody to see him die. But I mean, how do you know that? Because he died, so you don't know. But anyway, let's move on. This is not all world history class, but this is all being shown as we look at it. So yes, Julius Caesar fell. That's supposed to be the slide. All right. Daniel 11, verse 20. Thank you, Judy. Then it says, then shall stand up in his estate. Now, what does it say? What does it say in your Bible? I hope you're following along. A what? A raiser of taxes in the glory of the kingdom, but within few days he shall be destroyed, neither in anger nor in battle. Now, that's a definite clue. A raiser of taxes, and this is the first Roman emperor whose name is Augustus. He took the title Augustus. His name was actually Octavian. And by the way, just fun FYI, the month of August is named after Augustus. And when Augustus became Roman emperor, some of you have probably heard of the Julian calendar, that Julius Caesar modified and arranged the calendar somewhat, correcting some of the way that it was off and fitting it together. Anyway, the month of August was shorter than the month of July. And because it was shorter, Augustus, when he became emperor on the death of Julius Caesar, said, I can't have a month that's shorter than that. So he took some days from, guess which month? February. You got it. And so now August is the same length, 31 days, as July, 31 days. And that's not relevant for any reason other than I just wanted to tell you it. So anyway, but the word August is not, I grew up, I thought August was just a month. And it is a month, but actually the word August, if you look up the meaning, it means exalted or great. And so when you take the title of Augustus, wasn't a name, it's a title. So when you call yourself Augustus, you're calling yourself in a magnified, in a great way. And so the first Roman emperor, he ruled for 40 years. And so for a long time, you can see the dates here. I put it up here from 27 BC to 14 AD. And of course, Jesus, based on Daniel 9, remember the 70-week prophecy, we could pinpoint when Jesus died. And so we can go back when he was baptized. We know when that was, in 27 AD. We can back up 30 years because we know Jesus was 30 when he started his ministry. According to the scriptures, Jesus was born in 4 BC. And so who was the Roman emperor at that time in 4 BC? From 27 BC to 14 AD, on both sides of BC, it's this person right here. And what do we read in Luke chapter 2 and verse 1? There was a decree that all the world should be taxed. And that decree was sent out by Caesar. And that Caesar is this guy right here, Caesar Augustus. A raiser of taxes, the time that that's why Mary and Joseph go to their home in Bethlehem, because they were instructed to go to their home where they were supposed to be taxed at. Even though Jesus was raised in Nazareth, they went home to Bethlehem because they were supposed to go home because of the decree of Caesar and the raising of taxes. All right, let's continue on. Daniel 11 and verse 21. What do we see here? And in his estate shall stand up a, what kind of person? A vile person, to whom they shall not give the honor of the kingdom, but he shall come in peaceably and obtain the kingdom how? By flatteries. The very next Roman emperor here, Tiberius, he was not, in fact, Augustus did not want him to be his heir. In fact, he wanted several other people to be his heir, but they kept dying before Augustus died, so that he had to kind of consider him. Augustus was married several times, and this was, I think, Livia, his third or fourth wife, and her son, anyway, she kept pushing and pressuring him to make her son the heir, Tiberius. And so very reluctantly did Augustus decide to let her son be the heir, and right after he agreed to that, Augustus died. And some people think that Livia poisoned him with some mushrooms so that it would speed up his death so that her son could be the king. There was so much intrigue and terrible things back then. I mean, it's almost all the Roman emperors did not die a natural death. Almost all of them. And in fact, I can't think of any that did a natural death. They were not assassinated or poisoned in some way. So, I don't want to be Roman emperor. No thanks. Rule over them. No thank you. And so here's Tiberius. He took the place of Augustus, and he was a vile emperor. I know we're adults here, but I can't even begin to describe. This is in 2005 when I also went to London, Paris, and Rome. I went down to my sister was stationed. My sister's husband was stationed in the military in a NATO base in Naples, Italy. And just off the coast of Naples, Italy, when I went to see her, is this island here called Capri. I've heard of a Capri salad. That literally comes from this island. But Tiberius, this guy, he had a villa, a pleasure palace up here on the highest point. And this is actually a sketchy picture. Here's I here again. And I'm actually looking over, I'm actually up here on this cliff. You have to go way up here. It's a long hike, and it really is quite a hike up here. But it's beautiful. I mean, the Mediterranean, I mean, the water's clear. But Tiberius was up here, and he actually didn't want to rule from Rome because he was so perverted and just so vile in the way that he killed people every day. He would have, there's a place here called Jump Off Rock where he would just, people made him angry for the slightest thing. He would just have them thrown down off this, and it's just jagged rocks down below. And anyway, it's like 600 feet drop or so. But he really, I mean, all the Roman emperors were vile. I get that. But he was really pedophile. Anyway, I'm not going to go on and say other things, but he really stood up in the place that he became next in line. And I want you to notice, though, he is the one that is during the reign of Tiberius. Let's look at our next verse, Daniel 11, verse 22. This vile person. It says, and with the arms of a flood shall they be overflown from before him, and shall be broken, yea, also the what? Or the who, rather? The prince of the covenant. That should sound familiar. It's the same language of Daniel 9. The prince of the covenant that would be cut off in the midst of the 70th week there in Daniel 9. This is none other than a reference to the Prince of the Covenant, Jesus, being broken or being killed under the authority and during the reign of Tiberius. Now I know this is actually an artist's drawing of Pontius Pilate, and Pilate was not the emperor, he was just the procurator, the governor of the territory of Judea. But over his head, at the highest level, was actually Tiberius Caesar, that vile person. And remember, the people told Pilate, we have no king but Caesar. And then they said to Pilate, if you let this man go, Jesus, you are no friend of Caesar's. And so there was already some suspicion that Pilate maybe was not fully loyal to Caesar. And Pilate got nervous that if a report makes its way back to Tiberius, who already is a very cruel person, that his job and his head could very easily be on the line. And so they pushed him with the crowd. They peer pressured him to give in, and actually he says, 3 times Pilate said, I find no fault in Jesus. But he was still willing to have him killed to save his own position. But the historical records show that just a few years after Jesus was crucified, Pilate himself lost his position and committed suicide himself because of the shame and the embarrassment of what happened to him. He never lived, I think, a peaceful day after his decision to crucify Jesus. Anyway, so that is, of course, a huge event in world history. And here it is in Daniel 11, verse 22. All right, let's keep moving on forward. So we know we're from the time of Christ now. We're moving on. 23 and 24. It says, and after the league made with him, he shall work deceitfully, for he shall come up and shall become strong with a small people. He shall enter peaceably, even upon the fattest places of the province, and he shall do that which his fathers have not done, nor his fathers' fathers. He shall scatter among them the prey, and spoil, and riches, yea, and he shall forecast his devices against the strongholds, even for a time. And so, here's just a small description of these 2 verses, where it talks about the Jews and Rome actually made a pact as Rome was coming to power back, or a league of friendship, treaty in 161 BC. And this describes the characteristics of Rome, and it talks about, one of the differences is that Babylon, Medo-Persia, and Greece conquered and won their territory largely through military might, but Rome conquered through its military might, but also through politics and kind of a political treachery, forming leagues and making agreements and causing people to come under their influence and authority by way of these treaties. As it kind of references here in a different way, as it says there in verse 24, that he would, he shall do that which his fathers have not done, nor his fathers' fathers. And it's a description of how they would come and choose and fight in such a way as to use diplomacy to gain influence and to gain power. Now, in 25 through 27, we're going back to Cleopatra and these events that took place around the time that, right after Julius Caesar died, 25 through 27. It says, and he shall stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south with a great army, and the king of the south shall be stirred up to battle with a very great and mighty army, but he shall not stand, for they shall forecast devices against him. Yea, they that feed of the portion of his meat shall destroy him, and his army shall overflow, and many shall fall down slain. And both these kings' hearts shall be to do mischief, and they shall speak lies at one table, but it shall not prosper, for yet the end shall be at the time appointed. Now what is going on here? The two kings are going to sit and talk lies to each other. This is a reference to, there was a pact after Julius Caesar died amongst his adopted nephew, who was Octavian, and then Mark Antony, who was one of his best generals. And these generals, at first they worked together, but they sat at the table and lied to each other because both of them did not want to share the Roman Empire. They wanted to have it all for themselves. And so they both secretly plotted to fight against each other. But Mark Antony went to Egypt and had a crush on Cleopatra. It seems like every guy that came by had a crush on Cleopatra. And so he enlisted Cleopatra's help to fight against Octavian, who was going to be the future Augustus. And at this Battle of Actium in 31 BC, which is being described somewhat in reference here, Cleopatra got scared with her forces when they are all there at the battle, and so she took 60 of her ships and started to retreat and leave. And as Mark Antony is beginning to fight and sees Cleopatra leaving, well then he follows after her, and then some of his soldiers in disgust, like, what are you doing? Why are you leaving to go with her? They defected over to Octavian's side, and he was only too glad to receive them. And so now Octavian has a larger force, chases down Antony and Cleopatra, who run back to Egypt, and they both commit suicide there. And Octavian is the one who stands and has all of Rome to himself at that time forward, after this key battle of Actium in 31 BC. Well, in Daniel 11:28, let's see what we are going to find next. It says, Then shall he return into his land with great riches, and his heart shall be against the, what does it say? The Holy Covenant, and he shall do exploits and return to his own land. Describing, again, the rise of Rome, and so much so that it would do exploits and even fight against the covenant and those that believed in keeping the covenant. And we see a picture of the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans in AD 70. By the Roman general Titus, AD 70. Titus comes in, this is just an artist's drawing. You know, Josephus is a Jewish historian that defected to the Roman side. And he himself, we actually have his records. He was an eyewitness to these events right here. And in his writings, which modern historians don't believe fully, but he records that 1,100,000 Jews were slaughtered in this event, the destruction of Jerusalem. 1,100,000, and then he records that over 100,000 were taken in chains captivity back to Rome. And so this is a major, significant event that took place here. And this is a picture of Titus. He actually would go on after his dad died. His dad's name was Emperor Vespasian, and he would become emperor himself. And Titus is the one that was emperor when the Colosseum, the large building where the gladiators, in fact, that's the Colosseum right through there. This is actually a picture of what's called the Arch of Titus, right here. And it was constructed entirely to commemorate his campaign and defeat against the Jewish nation, which are, used to be God's people. But remember, at the 70-week prophecy at AD 34, they sealed their rejection of the message of Jesus, and they sealed their rejection of the gospel by not only killing Jesus, but they also stoned the apostles and disciples, beginning with Stephen. And that marks the end of their probation, or the time that was granted to them to repent and return to the position God called them to be. And so from that point forward, AD 34, they've been groping around as a nation in darkness. They still follow forms and do worship and things, but they have not followed and accepted Jesus as the one that was, all the Old Testament points to Jesus. And Jesus says that in a number of places. John 5:39 and 40, and Luke 24:27. And beginning at Moses and all the prophets, he, Jesus, expounded unto his disciples in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. But here's what's kind of sad. I've been there, and this is not actually my picture. This is in downtown of Rome, what's called the Forum, the headquarters for their government. But if you look on the inside here, this area, there's what's called a bas-relief, bas or bas-relief, which is a type of carving. It's not a full sculpture, but it's carved into something, the marble. And you can see on here, I don't know if you can tell what this is from where your vantage point is, but this is actually a contemporary carving from the time that the 7-branch candlestick called the menorah was still in existence. Now, we don't know what happened to it in history after it was captured by the Romans, because there's several things that say the Romans melted it down and made coins out of it. And why would they care about the 7-branch candlestick? Or that later on, Rome was sacked by the Vandals, and some reports say the Vandals took it back to their home in North Africa, and they melted it down and made coins out of it. But I don't know, I don't think that it's still around, but it's been lost in history. But even today, the Jewish nation, their picture of the menorah is based on this carving, which is sadly in Rome, Italy, and it's a picture of, this did not have to be the case. If the Jews would have repented and turned to God and humbled themselves as a nation, they could have still stood as His special people that were to give the message that God designed for them to give to the world. But now that message has been given to the Christian church, the message of the gospel that is for everyone. Those that have the message are not better than other people. They have a bigger responsibility to share it with other people because they know the message. So anyway, all right, let's move on here. Now we're going to get to Constantinople in Daniel 11 and verse 29. Let's see here. At the time appointed, he shall return and come toward the south. It doesn't say he would go to the south. It just says he would come toward the south. But it shall not be as the former or as the latter. And in 330, the Roman Emperor Constantine shifted the headquarters of the Roman government from Rome all the way over to a city today that's called Istanbul in Turkey. Initially it was called Byzantium. Then it was called Constantinople, renamed for Constantine. And then it was called today Istanbul. It's had 3 different names, but it's the same city. And it's right here. You can see, notice this artist's drawing. It's actually surrounded by water on 3 sides. So there's only one way to approach it, by land, and they actually had 3 stages of walls that were around on the land that you would have to break through in order to get to the city. 3 different stages of walls. And this right here is actually called the Hippodrome. This is a place where they had famous horse races and chariot races, kind of like the Circus Maximus that was in Rome. They had the circus, the chariot races, but this is in Constantinople. And so there's a shift away. Now I want you to notice, as the capital of Rome shifts over and the emperor set up a new headquarters in Constantinople, there is a vacancy and a vacuum left in Rome in terms of leadership, because the emperor is gone. And you can probably guess from the chapters we've studied before, who do you think is going to step into that vacuum or vacancy as a leader and as someone that's important and impressive? Well, it's going to be, you can probably guess, the Roman Catholic papacy is going to step into that place that's been vacated now by the Pope. By the Roman emperors. All right, let's read Daniel 11, verse 30. For the ships of Chittim shall come against him, therefore he shall be grieved and return and have indignation against the holy covenant. So shall he do, he shall even return and have intelligence with them that forsake the holy covenant. Have intelligence with those who forsake the holy covenant. This verse is a transition verse from just pagan Rome or imperial Rome into a papal Rome or religious phase of the King of the North, as papal Rome replaces imperial Rome as the King of the North. And this is an artist's drawing of a famous event that took place in the 400s of Pope Leo, right here, meeting, this is Attila the Hun. The Huns had mounted a massive campaign to come and attack and destroy and sack and pillage Rome and Italy. But here, as they come to the verge of the city, Pope Leo comes out with an embassy of emissaries, rather, to go and plead with Attila. Don't attack the city, please don't attack, and just have mercy, and please let us be. And there's some debates as to why Attila did this, but he did not go forward and actually returned and left. And this greatly exalted and magnified the prestige of the popes, because they're seen as the saviors of Rome, the ones that delivered Rome from the attacks of these barbarian Huns that are coming against them. They're seen as great, tremendous leaders. And as what we've learned about the popes, they actually combine religious power and temporal or political power. So let's see that beginning of this connection with political power in Daniel 11, verse 31. It says, "And what shall stand on his part?" What does it say in your Bible? And arms shall stand on his part. Now, you might have heard of in the Cold War, when we had an arms race, and arms relating to, military and weaponry and so on. Arms shall stand on his part, his being the king of the north, his, at this point, king of the north being the papacy. For the first time in history, in 508, this is an artist drawing of Clovis, who is actually a pretty great tribal leader back in the 300s and 400s, AD. He was king of the Franks. The Franks were one of those 10 Germanic tribes that had been part of the 10 horns, that came up on the beast of Rome, that divided up the territory that had been part of Rome in the beast of Daniel 7. And Clovis made an agreement with the Pope and said, I will give you my sword, or the power of my military, to fight for you and to back up whatever you say. In other words, I will fight battles for you, and will join together as a political supporter of your objectives and your ideas. Clovis was the first to do that. We're actually going to see a significant date in Daniel 12 that relates to Clovis, so tuck him away and we'll see that later. This is significant. Clovis is king of the who? Franks. Keep that in mind. King of the Franks. The first one. There were other kingdoms around them. Clovis actually worked to help convert all these other tribes that are around the Franks to convert them to Christianity. But Clovis himself was only coming from a pagan background, it was only a nominal conversion. And by nominal, that just means in name only. You can call yourself a Christian, but if you don't practice like a Christian and live like a Christian, then you're just claiming a name, but that's not really with the transformation that's supposed to come with it. So Daniel 11 and verse 32. Let's see. It says, and such as do wickedly against the covenant shall he corrupt by flatteries, but the people that do what? Know their God shall be what? And somebody ought to say amen. All right, so the people that do know their God, and that still applies today, I think, the people that do know their God shall be strong, and it even says, and do exploits. And during this time period, Daniel 11:32, there in the papacy, is a description for the king of the north. The Waldenses, during the time of the rise of the papacy in the Dark Ages, were a class and a group of people that lived in the high mountain alpine regions of Italy, but they maintained the truth of the Bible. In fact, there's a small town nearby here called Valdez, North Carolina, down Interstate 40. It's actually exit 111. Easy to remember. And they actually have the town, Valdez, is named after the French word Vaudois. And the French word Vaudois is what is describing these Waldenses that came over in the 1800s and settled in this area of North Carolina. And they actually have 15 stations that you can walk through. You have to pay to walk through there. I've done it before. And it describes the history of these people. They were quiet, pastoral, and farmers, but they were hated by the papacy because they believed in worshiping and keeping the truth as it is in the Bible. And they would not acknowledge the Pope as being God on earth and the leader of the church on earth. And that just made them so angry that they wanted to persecute and punish and kill them. And so they mounted actually many campaigns. It's estimated that hundreds of thousands of Waldenses died over the course of the Middle Ages, which is the time of papal supremacy, that 1260 years from 538 to 1798. Well, let's look at Daniel 11:33 to 35. We're going to look at the persecution of God's people. And we saw that in Daniel 7:25, that little horn representing the papacy would actually, the saints would be handed over into his hands for a time, times, and dividing of times, and they would be under the control of this persecuting power. All right, 33. It says, and they that understand among the people shall instruct many, yet they shall what? Fall by the sword, and by flame, by captivity, and by spoil. And it says many days. And that, I believe, is a reference to that. That it doesn't say it in numbers, but that's a reference to that 1,260 years that is mentioned in Daniel 7, verse 25. The times, dividing of times. That's a reference to that time period. That long and many days that they would be persecuted. The time of papal supremacy. So verse 34, now when they shall fall, they shall be, King James says, holpen with a little help. Help with a little help, but many shall cleave to them with flatteries, and some of them of understanding shall fall, to try them and to purge, and to make them white, even to, now here's the key phrase in verse 35, even to what? The time of the end. We know definitively. I can guarantee you with all that I have and know, 1798 is that date there. That's getting much closer to the time we're living in today. Just 200 years ago, a little over, from where we are. The time of the end is beginning there. It's a reference to in verse 35, and I'm going to explain. Yes, I need to explain. And it says, yet before it is a time appointed. This is a picture in 1572 of what was called the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. And this was a huge planned massacre of Protestants or Huguenots by Catholic authorities and Catholic leaders to lure all of these Protestants to come into Paris for a royal wedding, and in which they did come under good faith that, hey, it's a wedding, let's all get along, let's just be nice. And at the sound of a bell toll at midnight, on one of the nights there, right after the wedding, there was an order given to go and exterminate and eliminate and massacre all of these innocent men, women, children, young, old, not sparing any age, and it's estimated at about 70,000. 70,000. One of the most brutal murders, murdering that many people that they set forth there. And so what do we just read? I mean, this is just one example of the persecution that Protestants faced from the papacy, because they did not tolerate anyone that disagreed with them. And when the news of this actually reached the Pope, that all of this slaughter had occurred, he actually had a medal order to be made, and it's actually still in the Vatican today, this medal you can see, and the sounding of the bells in Rome, and a joyous celebration that so many tens of thousands of innocent people were just cut down in slaughter. But what did it say there in that verse? It said the saints would be helping with a little help. Help with a little help. What is that help a reference to? How many of you know what this is right here? This is a picture of Martin Luther, and he is nailing something on a door there in Wittenberg, Germany, and it is the 95 Theses. 95 statements or declarations that are in a statement of why indulgences are not biblical, and they are not something that God sanctions and wants people to do. And so when he nailed that on the door there in 1517, we just had the 500-year anniversary last October. 500 years from this event we're looking at right here. It caused, in a large degree, to a significant degree, a lessening of the persecution as Protestantism begins to arise. Martin Luther is the one that strikes the beginning of the Protestant Reformation and saying, hey, people have gotten away from the Bible. We've got to get back to what does the Bible say. That's what matters, not what popes or councils or bishops or any of these others. I want to know what the Bible says. And during the Dark Ages, the papacy had forbidden the Bible to be held or had by people. And so when people cannot read the Bible, they cannot find out what is true. And so isn't it interesting that another name for the Middle Ages is the Dark Ages? Because spiritually, when you set aside the light of the truth of the Word of God, there's no real progress in society. There's no advancement in society in any area, because God has been set aside and it's been replaced by systems and forms that are just empty, and it's not really based on what God would have us to do. So that is a tremendous help that came to the God's people that lessened persecution. Now, it did not end it, though. I'll certainly say it did not end. And then also here, Daniel 11, verses 36 and 37. And, all right, we're coming down to near the end. We're going to make it, I hope. It says, and the king shall do according to whose will? His will. And the king here, some people might question, wait, how can you call the Pope a king? In reference to the king of the north. Remember, the Pope claims not only religious authority, but temporal political authority. The Vatican state that exists today is a state. It exists as a state, even though the leader of that state claims religious power, he also claims political power. And so it's not a misassociation to call the Pope a king, because that is in fact what they ascribe to be. All right, let's read these verses here. 36. And the king, that is the king of the north, that is the Pope, shall do according to his will, and he shall what? Exalt himself and magnify God? No. Magnifying himself above every god, and shall speak marvelous things against the God of gods, that is the true God, and shall prosper till the indignation be accomplished. I believe that's until 1798 and the end of papal supremacy. That's coming up in a moment. For that is determined shall be done. And then it says, neither shall he regard the God of his fathers, nor the desire of women, nor regard any God, for he shall magnify himself above all. Now those are some big words right there. Who would fit that description that would magnify themselves above everyone else, and that would magnify themselves even above God? Notice this statement here, during the Middle Ages and the power of the church as it grew and grew, during that time period, 1260 years, it says all medieval Christians were expected to obey canon law, that's church law, which governed religious practices. Popes have power over political leaders through threat of, there's two things here, and I've talked about this before, excommunication, which is where you lose your position in the church, and you are basically thought to be a lost soul who is going to be eternally damned, and there's no way you're outside salvation, and there's nothing, you are for sure going to be lost because of the Pope excommunicating you. But they also had a tool that they began to use called the interdict. And popes would use an interdict, which is excommunicating not only a person, but a whole town or village or even a whole kingdom. And yes, there are examples of popes that put all of England under the interdict. For example, King John. You might have heard of King John with Robin Hood, Nottingham, and some of those stories. King John was placed under the interdict because the Pope got mad at him. And when you're placed under the interdict, the Pope's orders would mean that all the churches should be closed. People could not see the priest for confession and for receiving the sacraments. And as a result of that, because they believe that sacraments are the channels of salvation, you yourself can't be saved. And so now everyone's going to be up in arms at the king and say, you got to open the churches. Whatever the Pope's telling you to do, you need to do it so we can be saved. And it puts tremendous political pressure on the ruler, the political ruler, to bow to the wishes of the Pope. And every time it happened, the rulers always bowed down and listened to whatever the Pope said. And so that was a theme across the Middle Ages. Many people have forgotten that history, but it was there and it still exists today. There are still, even today, part of their religious services, it involves bowing down to and prostrating yourselves before the Pope. And back in history, they even would have kings and rulers, and they've kind of gone away from this, but now you don't kiss the Pope's foot, you kiss his ring. Because it's a little degrading to kiss the foot of the Pope. But back in the time of papal supremacy, it was a regular common practice. And here's a picture of King Henry of the Holy Roman Empire, who he had been placed under the interdict, and all of his nobles had abandoned him. He was going to lose his throne because of this trying to dispute with the Pope over this matter of appointing one of the bishops. A bishop. So he goes to where the Pope is in Canossa, Italy, and in the snow for 3 days, he and his wife and his young son, he's barefooted, he stands outside in a snowstorm with, and I know the artist here, this is just a cutout, you can't see that there's supposed to be snow on the ground. He's waiting and begging for the Pope, who's inside, sitting warmly, comfortably, to come and open the door so he can ask for forgiveness and so he can have his kingdom restored to him. And so the Pope didn't want to give him his kingdom back, but he wound up giving it back to him anyway. But the popes actually said it's our job to humble the pride of kings. And during the Middle Ages, this happened regularly. You did not defy or dispute with the power that was wielded by the Catholic Church and the papacy. Let's look at Daniel 11, verses 38 and 39. But it says, but in his estate shall he honor the God of forces. And this is, of course, honoring the God of forces, that they would be supportive of those that give their political power to them. And does God ever force anyone anyway? By the way, does God ever, can you think of any example when Jesus forced somebody to do something? To believe, and remember when there were some of his disciples and they went through Samaria and they didn't want them to come through, and they said, well, do you want us to call down fire on them? And Jesus rebuked his disciples and said, you don't know what spirit you're of. God never forces people. I want to be clear on that. And so God's people, Christians, will never exercise power. Remember when Peter tried to use force and cut off the high priest's ear, Malchus, and chopped off his ear, and Jesus doesn't say, good job, Peter, let's start a revolution. No, Jesus actually rebuked Peter and said, "Put your sword back in its place. For those who live by the sword shall die by the sword." And Jesus made it clear that he came to establish a spiritual kingdom, and the weapons of the spiritual kingdom are not swords and guns and flamethrowers, but it's the Word of God. And if the Word of God won't convict someone, I'm not to use my gun or sword to try to force them to do what God says. It's only their choice through whatever way that the Holy Spirit works on their heart to convict them that should be the reason they would change. But the weapons are the Word of God, which is more powerful than a sword in a lot of ways. So, a physical sword. All right, 38-39. "But in it the God of forces, and a God whom his fathers knew not, shall he honor with gold and silver and with precious stones and pleasant things. Thus shall he do in the most strongholds with a strange God, whom he shall acknowledge and increase with glory, and he shall cause them to rule over many, and shall divide the land for gain." All right, a couple of slides on this point. Can you see what Pope Francis is doing in this slide right here? Can you tell what's happening right here? All right, this is Pope Francis. He's being summoned or accompanied here. He's offering incense before. Now, what does it look like right here? Oh, it's Mary. And it says in that verse there that he would worship a God that his fathers did not worship. I mean, the true Christians never worship Mary. Mary is viewed as a co-redemptrix, a co-mediatrix, a mediator with Christ. But the Bible is very clear in 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 5. Let me think if I'm getting this right. It says, "For there is one God and one mediator between God and man, the man Christ Jesus." There's one mediator. There's not a co-mediator. There's not two. We don't pray to Mary to help us get a better seat next to Jesus. And because Mary has an in with Jesus as his mother, we can get a better access to Jesus. God forbid. We only are to pray to Jesus. Mary herself would have to pray to Jesus. I mean, when she was alive on earth. It's not by... Anyway, so, there's more that can be said on that, but that clearly, the inclusion and the position, I just wanted you to see just one slide of how Mary is really magnified and exalted in a tremendous way. So, I think I already talked about some of these. I'm going to move on. Yes, God of coercion, rule over many. I mentioned most of that. I'm going to keep moving on for the sake of time. I want you to see this verse, where it talked about in verse 39, "He shall cause them to rule over many and shall divide the land for gain." Interesting. Did you know that there's a time in world history when the Pope actually divided the world? Now, I'm not making this up. People took this seriously and legitimately. Notice the dates here for this. Pope Alexander, this is called the line of demarcation. You study this in American history and also in world history. But this comes about. Now, does anyone notice what happened around 1493? Very close to that. Who knows their world history? Okay, we all know the little song, "Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. So this is right after Columbus. And do you remember that Columbus actually, he was from Italy. He himself was ethnically an Italian, but he got trained over in Portugal under Prince Henry the Navigator, but he sailed, there's Portugal there, and he sailed for Spain. And so when he goes over and he lands somewhere in the Caribbean, and then he comes back home, and he's telling everybody, "I found all this new land, and this is amazing." And now the Spanish are like, "Hey, that's great, we're going to claim all of it for ourselves." The Portuguese are like, wait. He got his training and education from us. That's not fair. And so both the Portuguese and the Spanish complained to the Pope to settle the dispute. And so here's how powerful the Pope was. In 1493, this Pope Alexander VI, he actually drew a line and just said, all the land that's on the right side of this line will belong to Portugal, and all the land that's on the left side will belong to Spain. Yeah. Does anyone see who got a raw deal? Now, it's interesting. Do you know what country is right here today? What language do they speak? Okay, that's exactly right. Even though Brazil today, of course, is a big piece over here, but this was their foothold over here before they started out with their access because it was given to them. And so Portuguese, but what language is spoken over here in Chile, and Argentina, and Ecuador, and Venezuela? Espanol, right? Spanish. And so, because the Pope divided the world at that point and said, everything on this side will be yours, and everything on that side will be yours, that's a pretty amazing thing. Where did I put my Bible? So, anyway, shall divide the land for gain, and that's pretty powerful to be able to do that. So let's continue on with our last 6 verses. And we're looking at now, as you can probably guess, I believe from 40 part B onward, we're looking at events that are either current or future. Everything that we've studied at this point, a few more pieces here. 40A is going to be in the past, a reference to the past, but we're going to be looking at things as it relates to the future, and I need to keep moving on. All right, Daniel 11, verse 40, it says, and at what? There's that same phrase that was in verse 35. We're also going to see that phrase in Daniel 12 in our next week. And it's going to be clear in Daniel 12 that it refers to, and I put this in here on my slide, the beginning of the time of the end is in 1798. The beginning of the time of the end. And that, of course, is the end of this 1,260 year of papal supremacy that's referenced. And if you want the references for this, it's mentioned in Daniel 7:25 as the times, and dividing of times. We're going to see it next week in Daniel 12:7, the same reference for the same time period. And then watch this in Revelation 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it's mentioned 7 times in Daniel and Revelation, this time period. So it's significant. It's a serious, significant time period that relates to this time when this little horn and this papal power would demonstrate its character over a long period. So no one would have any question, what is this power really like? You date someone for more than a day before you get married, right? Because you want to know, what are they really like? And you have some time to kind of see, what are they like under good circumstances and bad circumstances. And so people have forgotten this time period of what it was like in the time of papal supremacy. All right, still in verse 40. It says, at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots and with horsemen and with many ships, and he shall enter into the countries and shall overflow and pass over. Now it says, now here we have a reintroduction of the king of the south, which has been gone for many verses. And it says that the king of the south shall come and push against him. Push is kind of a nice word for attack and gore and destroy. And the king of the south that actually came and fought against and destroyed and took captivity, the Pope, is France during the French Revolution. You might say, well, how can France be the king of the south? I want you to realize something. France, during the French Revolution, is the only large-scale country in modern recorded history to abolish God. The National Assembly of France, they passed a law and abolished God. In fact, one of the revolutionaries, whose name was Chaumette, actually said, I defy you, God, that if you exist, that you show your face, and we're not scared of your thunderbolts. And I'm paraphrasing a little bit now, but you can read how some historians, like Thomas Carlyle, record how just blasphemously saying, defend your name, and we abolish you, because they were just completely pushing against And now what's interesting is that France, if you recall, was the first, under Clovis, the king of the Franks, to give the sword to the papacy, and they're the first to take it away and say, we're not going to give our support to you anymore under France. And so France, though, is at the time, as atheistic France, Egypt, I want you to remember during the time of Pharaoh, Egypt under Pharaoh, when the 10 plagues came and they were going to be let out of Egypt, Pharaoh said, I don't know who God is. Who is Jehovah that I should let your people go? And speaking to Moses, and I don't know who he is, and I'm not going to let him go. I mean, Egypt is a symbol for atheism, to deny the power and existence of God. And France, during this time, in such a pushback against the Catholic Church, denied the existence of God and took the Pius IV, captive, and he died in exile. And for a time, the papacy was abolished and was no more. In Daniel 11, verse 40. But then, we see though, let's keep reading, it talks about how he shall enter also into the glorious land, and many countries shall be overthrown, but these shall escape out of his hand, even Edom and Moab and the chief of the children of Ammon. Well, it talks about, you know what, in fact, I'm actually, my slide goes with the rest of the last part of verse 40. The king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind. The him is the king of the south. The king of the south is atheism. And atheism found its fullest expression, I believe, in our modern times under the system of communism. If you know anything about communism, and it's an economic system, it is entirely atheistic. And it is antagonistic towards Christianity and a belief in God. And it's interesting here, it talks about how the king of the north would get help in some way, come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots and with horsemen, and with many ships. I don't have the time to unpack all of that because it's already getting late, but all of that represents economic and military power. Ships and all those things, it's a symbol for, and chariots, it represents military and economic power. If you study out the verses in the Bible, you see that symbolism in different places. And in 1992, we have this magazine cover, Time magazine, saying Holy Alliance. The United States under President Reagan, working together at the time with Pope John Paul II, conspired to bring down and bring an end to communism. In fact, you have this famous speech here by, and I can remember this, I was in 7th grade in 1987. Guess how old I am? But when President Reagan gave this speech, and here's at the Brandenburg Gate, right here beside the entrance of what was the Berlin Wall, dividing communistic Germany and capitalist Germany. And he made this declaration to the leader of the Soviet Union at the time, Mr. Gorbachev, and that was in June 12, 1987. And then in 1989, we find the Berlin Wall falling down. And it was one of the great secret alliances of all time, according to that Time News magazine article, that the United States worked together to help overthrow. Now communism still exists today. I want to be clear about that. I'm not saying it's completely eliminated, but it certainly received a serious blow when Russia and the whole eastern bloc of Europe fell to capitalism and fell the communistic system. There's only 5 countries today that are communist, and China is one of them. And of course, China is one of the major countries of the world. China, North Korea, Vietnam, Laos, and I forgot what the other one is. Somebody will have to tell me. Cuba, thank you. Thank you, it is Cuba. Now, Daniel 11, verse 41. We're getting into much closer to our own time. He shall enter also into the glorious land. I believe the glorious land is no longer a symbol as it was earlier for Palestine and Israel, literal. I believe the glorious land represents the church. And now that we're not talking about geographic, we're talking about spiritual terminology, and the glorious land, which is where literal Israel once was, is a picture for the church. And it says here, the glorious land, that he, that is the king of the north, that is the papacy, shall enter into the glorious land, and many countries shall be overthrown. But these shall escape out of his hand, even Edom and Moab and the chief of the children of Ammon. And so, just in a nutshell, I think there's a tremendous ecumenical movement where the Pope has really, and these are all evangelical Protestant leaders. You've got Kenneth Copeland right here, and some of his, Tony Palmer, meeting together, smiley time with the Pope. And then you've got, oh my, I'm blanking on this guy's name, from over in California. What's the big church, mega church? Rick Warren, thank you. Meeting here with the Pope. And then also even the late Billy Graham, who just passed away, meeting with Pope John Paul II. All of these leaders wanting to get advice and counsel and just the influence, I think, that the popes have over what is supposed to be Protestant. Protestant, the root word for Protestant is protest. And it originated out of a protesting of the Pope calling himself the head of the church, which is not a biblical position that is described in the Bible in the way that he tries to exercise that. But now the Protestants want to run back to, and they can't fall over themselves fast enough to hug and take pictures and cuddle up with the Pope. And so this encroachment, this ecumenical movement that we see taking place, I think, is described in some of these verses. 42 through 43. He shall stretch forth his hand also upon the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape, but he shall have power over the treasures of gold and of silver, and over all the precious things of Egypt, and the Libyans and the Ethiopians shall be at his steps. And there's a lot of little small symbolism and details in some of these things, but this is inside St. Peter's Basilica, and this is the papal altar, and I have some references in my notes if you want them, but the Roman Catholic Church is quite possibly the most wealthy organization on the planet. No one knows how much money they have because they don't have to disclose it all, but the amount of money worldwide and investments and that they have, it's estimated up to $1 trillion or more, $1 trillion, which is just far beyond combining all of Jeff Bezos at Amazon and Bill Gates and Warren Buffett. Combining all that together and then beyond that, way more money. The wealth and extravagance that has been amassed by this power, I think, is clearly described in this verse, speaking of the King of the North. But here we come to our last two verses. Verse 44, but what does it say? Tidings out of the east and out of the north shall trouble him. Interesting. Tidings out of the east, the word tidings in the Hebrew really just is a word for message. Like if you're bringing tidings, as if you're coming bearing a message from one person to another person. And it says tidings out of the east. In the Bible, if we had more time, we could look at how the east and the north are oftentimes symbols for the throne of God. And if you look at Revelation 7 verse 2, it talks about an angel ascending out of the east having the seal of the living God. In Revelation 7 verse 2. And in the Old Testament it talks about where God dwells on the mount and the sides of the north. That is actually, the true king of the north at the end of this whole study is really God. God is the true person who should have our loyalty, our obedience, our affections, our focus. It should be God himself. And anyone else that tries to replace that is a false king of the north. And so the north has significance symbolically because it's the direction where God's throne is located, that we're told, in heaven. And of course his throne is the foundation of his existence and his government. But in Revelation 14 verses 6 through 12, and we're going to study Revelation, so don't worry, but there's a message given there by three holy angels that are flying in the midst of heaven. And that message, I believe, is what these tidings out of the east are that troubles the papacy. That troubles and really concerns and bothers and makes them angry. Because this message in Revelation 14, 6 through 12 is the last message that's given to earth before Jesus comes. In that chapter, this message is given, and then immediately after that message is the coming of the Son of Man, the second coming of Jesus. And so this message that's given here is three angels. It's a threefold message. Is really to prepare people to worship the true God and to follow what is truth and not follow any counterfeits and follow anyone else that would claim to represent or take the place of God. And so we'll look at in significant detail when we get to that in Revelation. But if you want to plug that in, that's what I believe is referred to here that really troubles the papacy, because this is a divine message from God himself that all people must know to be ready for the coming of Jesus. All right. It says, "The tidings out of the north and the east shall trouble him. Therefore he shall go forth with great fury, angry because of the messages, to destroy and utterly to make away many." And then in verse 45, we're going to come here to our last verse. "And he," that is the king of the north, that is the papacy in this point of the study, "shall plant the tabernacles of his palace," I believe that's his influence, "between the seas." Water represents people in the Bible. Remember, we've seen that with the beasts that come up out of the water. "Between the seas in the glorious holy mountain, yet he shall come to his end, and none shall help him." And so I am under the impression that he, and of course the last part here, let's not miss that, that's clear. "He," the king of the north, "shall come to his end, and none shall help him." That's still yet in the future. That has not happened yet from where we're at now. In fact, we see the United States here when the Pope comes, just embracing and all excited about a person who claims to be the vicar of Christ and taking the place of Christ, and where Christ should be, and our focus on him in studying his word has placed it on a man living on earth. But this in the glorious holy mountain is a reference to, I think, God's true remnant church, that he would even try to influence and plant his power right in the middle of where God's people are. Not that he's going to leave them alone, but he's going to try his best to destroy, to persuade, to flatter, whatever it takes to cause them to give up their allegiance in God and his word and to follow this false system. But we need one more verse, and that verse is in chapter 12, verse 1 before we close. We have to have the next verse because it gives us a clear picture of where we are. Because remember, there's no break in the chapters from 10 to 12. Daniel 12, verse 1, it says, "And at that time," when the king of the north is completely put away and his power is broken, and it says, "None shall help him," at that time shall who stand up?
Great prince.
Michael stand up. And I have told you, I am fully convinced that Michael is a name and a reference for Jesus Christ. Michael shall stand up, and it says here, "The great prince which standeth for the children of thy people." Who is it that stands for God's people but Jesus? There's no one else that can really fit that description. It says, "Michael shall stand up." And so what does that mean? What does that represent? That is where we find our understanding as we've seen the cleansing of the sanctuary and the judgment happening now, that there's a work taking place in heaven that Jesus is involved in the most holy place, investigating the characters of all those who've ever claimed his merits. And at the time when it says here that he stands up, that means that his intercession is finished, That means that his judgment is done, and that means that probation has closed, and it is just before he comes. Now I want you to realize something. Just like with the flood and the ark, remember that probation closed and the door of the ark was closed 7 days before the flood itself actually came. So probation closes a short time before Jesus himself comes. People on earth, no one will necessarily know that it's happened, but we're to live in such a way that we're ready on every day, at every moment, because I'm not putting off that decision to give myself to Christ and to say, Lord, help me, cleanse me, purify me through your incredible power and your love and grace. But this is a picture, though, that is still in the future. We have seen a lot of history tonight, but the last few verses, 41 to 45, and certainly 12:1, which is a continuous sequence, points us and pushes us all the way into the close of human probation. And we'll look at this again next week. And so if there's questions and you want to think about it, I'll talk about it some more next week. And so we come to the close of our study tonight. I'm terrified to ask if there's any questions because that's so much information. And it's 8:30, you need to be out of here. All right, let's see here. The angel Gabriel outlines events from the time of Daniel, that is with the Medes and Persians, all the way to the end of time, all the way down till Michael stands up. And Gabriel is speaking the whole time. So God's people will be caught between the fighting of the kings of the north and the kings of the south. We saw that in the literal fighting of the kings of the north and south. Also, too, in the time after the cross, God's people have been caught between these competing theories of atheism or between following a false system of worship set up by the Pope. God's people will suffer and endure hardships and persecutions, but, and here's a big but God has not forsaken them. So all these things are spelled out, and it's not to like, oh, this is terrible. It's to show us that God sees these things, and He allows His saints to be tried, as said, and be made white, purifying their lives, purifying their characters, and being willing to sacrifice for Him, and even give their lives for Him. But He sees that, and ultimately He will hold responsible those who persecute His people. Then finally, the king of the north, papal Rome, will come to its final end. This final king of the north, that is in verse 45. And then in chapter 12, verse 1, I didn't read the rest of the verse, I just quoted the first part. It says, and at that time, thy people shall be delivered, every one that shall be found written in the book. Remember, it's taking place now. There's an examination of the books. And so the book that's mentioned there, who's found written in the book, is the book of life. And so as we understand what God is doing, what Jesus is doing on our behalf, it is a thrilling understanding to see that He is such a great high priest for us.
Amen.
All right. Well, let me pray.